Fantastic. The noise is subsuming, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much. So we are here already for the third session of arguments. And today we have the pleasure of have Bas Princen with us. Bas Princen oh, you don't want to know who I am? Yes? Okay. I'm Joaquim Moreno, for those that don't know. I'm one among this very remarkable pool of instructors that has been gathered for arguments this semester. And my job today is to briefly, get out of the way, basically, and present Bas Princen, which is an artist and photographer from the Netherlands, living and working in Rotterdam. As it is in his biography, in his little biopic, in Storefront for Art and Architecture, where he did a remarkable exhibition in 2010, his work focused on the transformations of the urban landscape, researching the possible future scenarios and outcomes by the use of photography. I mean, he practices an extraordinary intersection with architecture practice, and his joint work with Office was awarded the Silver Lion in Venice for the Garden Pavilion 7 Rooms, 21 Perspectives exhibition. Other recent exhibitions include 5 Cities, Depot, Istanbul 2010, Invisible Frontier, AUT Innsbruck 2008, Nature as Artifice at the Krollenmüller Museum, Waterloo and Aperture Foundation in New York in 2009, Spectacular City in Rotterdam in 2006, Taking Cities in Essen in 2006, the Venice Biennale of Architecture of 2004 and 2006, and Shrinking Cities, Archilab, Orleans 2004, and Berlin 2005. In May 2004, he published a book about his work, Artificial Arcadia, with 010 publishers, with contributions by Bart Lotsma, Wim Kuivers, Lars Lierup, Dirk Simmons, and Jeff Durzen. In 2007, published Rotterdam with Witte de Witt publishers. In 2008, Gallerie Naturale for Linea di Confine. And in 2009, 5 Cities portfolio with Sun publishers. In 2005, he was awarded a residency in Los Angeles with the Mark Schindler Stipendium. And in April 2004, he won the Carlotta Koller Prize for Promising Artists and Architects in the Netherlands. Please join me in welcoming Bas Princen.
Thank you. It's nice to hear it. Yeah, a little bit less light. That would be good.
Is that?
Yeah.
Or it's too.
No, it's good. It's good. There is a little. Yes. Well, the introduction was already taking care of a lot of things. I'm a photographer, artist. And I sometimes collaborate with architects because I am also trained as an architect. But about this collaboration, I will not tell too many things today. I will tell more about the work which I recently finished, which is a book and an exhibition called Reservoir. And this image is just there just to start because it was 2 days ago. There was an opening in Cairo of the work, which was actually also shown in Storefront. And it was quite remarkable because it was stuck for 6 months in customs during the whole revolution. So we were very, very happy that it finally was cleared, and we had this little party outside of the gallery. The gallery is in the top, and this is inside. But that's just a little short thing. But actually, I will start with an image which I rarely use. I rarely use to start with it, and I even rarely use it. I rarely show it. But somehow I have the feeling it's a good one to start with because it can explain a little bit how I work. Basically, what you see is is a village in China. It's so-called a village in the city, and people who are living there are called the floating population, which basically means that it's a part of the city which used to be a village. The farmers started to construct houses in order to house all the people who are constructing the city. And the title of this work is called, very, very appropriate to what it actually is. It's called Future Highway. And I want to show you this because it's an image in which I can explain something about how I work. After I photograph this and I scan the image and I somehow like it, I have a certain idea that I try to make, and I see it back in it. I send these scans quickly to a couple of friends to test. And after I send this image, immediately, like 1 minute later, I got this image back from someone. And it's a tarot card. It's a tarot card called the Tower. And I Googled what it meant because I had no clue. And the first interpretation that came up said that when the tower is struck, one's understanding of reality will be altered or enter another dimension. And somehow I was pretty shocked because I thought this was it's quite interesting. Because actually what I think, if you take a photograph, this is almost what is happening. Because somehow when you take a photograph of something and you do it in a very constructed way, or you're trying to take something out of the reality in order to say something about it, you could say that you somehow use the reality against itself in order to make a fiction. So I liked it very, very much. I will take 5 steps back, just very quickly, for you to understand how I started to photograph. I'm trained as a designer for public space in a school called the Design Academy in Eindhoven. And I started to photograph because all the little designs that I was making, I found out that I could photograph them by excluding all kind of things that were in the direct surrounding. So by focusing or by altering the context to my liking, I could create a new place. And these images, let's say this series, which is called Artificial Arcadia, is all about the way how people use a certain man-made landscape. These are bird watchers. They are watching a bird which is in the middle. But for me, it was the way how I could alter the way how you look at the landscape. These are images from the exhibition which was in Storefront, which was called 5 Cities. And they are much more, they're from much later, and there is more architecture involved, or at least some kind of architecture, something that you could call a built structure, not. But for me, it has always a relation with let's say, with important ideas that are running within architecture. But I want to go, before I want to explain a bit more, I go to 2 other people, and maybe because the whole lecture is about the arguments, I mean, I would like to make an argument about how images more or less already exist, and you somehow have to update them. And I will show you 2 works. One is called Park City, and the other one is a very short clip from a movie from Werner Herzog, because I think they have something to do with each other, and they have something to do with the work Reservoir, which I made later. In Park City, I don't know if you know it, there's the he had a kind of a strange photographer, Louis Baltz. He's a kind of an enigmatic figure because he moved to Paris after he made a lot of good works, and after he moved, basically, he didn't make anything anymore. And this work becomes more and more important. It's a lot of photographers are quoting him, are trying to pick up the path which he left. And this is a work, Park City, in which I think it shows very clearly how you can manipulate a certain reality to your needs. Basically, Baltz would say that he is interested to document a certain symptomatic aspect of the society. In this case, a kind of second houses estate in Nevada. It's in the 80s, so it's in the early 80s. And then he would go on describing that just to document this kind of thing that seems to be going on everywhere is not enough, he would say, but I'm a photographer, so what are my other criteria? And his other criteria would be that he says, well, I like the image to be as flat and as sharp as possible. For that, I need to be as high up as possible. I need to have only a little bit of atmosphere between me and the subject. So he chose the highest possible second houses estate. So that was, in a way, his second decision. Then he photographs everything as though it's impossible to say whether things are being constructed or being destroyed. We know that it's being made, but that is something else. And then the fourth thing, and he doesn't talk about it himself, but he adopts a kind of style which you could almost imagine as a kind of a grainy war photography, in a way to kind of distance himself more from the subject. And I got interested in this because I heard from someone with who I was working on another project that Louis Baltz made this work after he saw something else. And this something else is, I have to go quickly to I will just do a little bit the YouTube clip. And this is, it's called Fata Morgana of Werner Herzog, which is a movie which is shot in the desert, in the Sahara, in the 70s. And Herzog says that he was trying to make a science fiction movie based on documents. And somehow, if you see this film and you see these photographs which Baltz made before, you can start to understand that they were not even inspired by each other, but somehow picking up each other's paths. I just let it run for just a little bit. And I think that this that this fact that you can take someone else's work and interpret it in a slightly different way and redo it on another spot, that this is something very important. It's almost the only way to make images that you as a viewer can recognize and can like. And it was only after this, actually while making this work called Reservoir, which took about 10 years, and in the meantime I did a lot of other things, but that doesn't matter. And somewhere halfway, I found this this book of Louis Balt's Park City, and when I found it, I all of a sudden realized. At that moment, I realized that this kind of ambiguity which he puts in the image, the ambiguity that you cannot tell whether it's a future or a past, whether things are being destroyed or being made, whether it's natural or not. That's a very interesting point that you can make, and that this ambiguity can be somehow a kind of a key focus. So this is the book. In the book, you can look at it later. It's lying here in the front. This is the image, which is the title. This image is called Reservoir. It was one of the first images that I made for this series, in which I understood that it was that it was something that could work very well. This kind of a strange relation between nature and something constructed, and at the same time, it's a reference to a work of Robert Smithson, which is called Asphalt Rundown, which he did in Rome. And somehow, when I saw this in reality, and I knew the work of Robert Smithson, I also immediately knew how to photograph it. And there again, you have this kind of image that becomes before the image, and that is something that is important. In order to make this book or this series, I took another image, which is it's this one. It's called the Leveling of the Hills to Make Seattle from 1911 by Asahel Curtis, if I'm not mistaken. And he documented the frontier after it was not anymore really a frontier, but after they started to make industrial cities. So the mountains that you see are little pieces of land that are not yet sold, so that are still owned by someone else. And it's incredible that your eye or your mind wants to believe, in the first instance, it wants to believe it's a kind of a natural landscape. But the more details you start to see, the more you understand that there's something else happening. So I introduced this image in my studio. It was there for like one year, I think. And in that time, when I was selecting the work, it kind of guided me to make, because the work, which is the book, is only 25 pictures, and it's taken from a selection of more than 100. And in order to make the selection, I used this image. So I decided that all the images that had to be in the book had to have one element of this picture, more or less, to return in. And I will just click through the images of the book without explaining where they are and without explaining what they are. That's the book. I will move now a little bit, because I find it hard to say something about this in individual pictures, but I can explain a little bit how they are made, how they relate to each other, or how I think that they relate to each other. I have as everyone has, I have this kind of a big amount of reference images, things that I think are important, things that everyone likes also probably, and somehow I try to use them in order to make my own works. So, but here we have I was already explaining before this, the main image, the reservoir image, comes from this work of Bas Princen called Asphalt Rundown. And it's this. But at the moment when this exists, I can also take this image for myself as a kind of a reference image for the next work which I'm making. And I can probably, I don't know which one is behind this. Oh yeah. So let's say if you take this one, which is called the Reservoir, this one is also called the Reservoir. This is another one which is not. If you take these three images together and you somehow imagine them on top of each other or elements of each other, to me you get this image. At the moment when I was making this one, which is in China, I remembered the composition of this one. I remembered the way how this concrete was going in the landscape here, and the kind of idea of a section which is here. And somehow these three images together make one new image and a new possibility to see something. And it's really about how you're able to see something in the reality where you're working, because it's all about the framing in the end. And then you can see again back the relation between this image and that image, at least to me. Then it was interesting because what I sometimes do, and I don't explain it often, and I definitely don't explain it to photography students, because they always freak out somehow, that I mirror sometimes images. I take the negative and I flip it in Photoshop to see it, which way it works better, if the idea which I want to communicate works better if it's flipped or not. And I was very happy to find, when I was searching for this image for which was going to be in the book, I found, and it's part of a museum, I found that another museum had this one in the collection. And they're both stated as the original version. And you already see that somehow you look at the image in a different way if it's flipped. Your eye moves on different details. It goes in a different way. It travels in a different way through the image. Then it can also happen that sometimes it's quite banal how you make a work. So I made this one. A few days later I made this one, and I think 1 day later I made this one. And it is a way how you set your mind to see certain things. And this one of course has nothing to do with this one, and this one also relates to something else, which to me is a kind of a super studio image. This of course famous work by Super Studio called The Continuous Monument. And at the moment when this one existed and this reference was there, I found, I could make this work, which is in LA, where I was on this spot very often, because I thought there is something to be done in this place, but I didn't know what. and I didn't know how. And only at the moment when I cropped off the top of the building and the building disappeared, I understood how that was the way, how it should be. And I also understood that at that moment it started to resemble the continuous monument. And for me, it's always important that there is this link to a certain idea which already exists, that can be traced back. And right after I made the inversion, and this is in Houston, in which the horizon makes the building disappear, more or less. And in order to disappear, it had to be a golden building. You have to say if we can still go on a little bit, or if we, yeah. And I want to explain this because it's not so, maybe it's not so clear why these images connect to each other, or why they're interesting, and but maybe more important, how it's possible to connect them and how to find them all together. This is another image which comes from, I think it comes from the website of CLUI, of the LA-based Center of Land Use Interpretation, and it's a picture of a interior where there used to be a model of a landscape to see how the water flows. I don't know how this is called, a kind of hydrological test lab. And somehow you can feel it that the soil which is beneath is not completely random, that there is some kind of a little order in there. And then if you go closer, you have this kind of details in this big mud. And I like that this model is inside, that it's inside of a building. And it has to do with the kind of work of Schuiter-Peters, which are Belgian cartoonists who are always using a fictional city as their subject. But it also has to do with something else, and this is, I don't know if you know Le Poème électronique by Le Corbusier, which was made by Philips in Eindhoven for the I think 52 or 53 exhibition in Brussels, the World Exhibition, and it is a double curved concrete shell, which at that time they couldn't make yet. They had no clue how to make the shells. So what they did, they took a whole hole of Philips. They took everything out and they casted sand in there, and all the elements. So the building is kind of imagined as layers. And all these layers are made by hand, and then the panels are casted on the sand, or they are handmade on the sand. So you had this kind of landscapes that were being made. And for me, that relates to this. Maybe it's a bit banal, but to me, it's important that there's certain images before my images. And then we go from, let's say, a landscape in a room to, a landscape in a room. And the inversion of it, which is a kind of a room as a landscape, more or less. And maybe we can keep it here, and we can start, and then there might be more things to do later. Something different than you normally do.
Good. I think the students are probably very. Think now about once you explain how these are images of images of images, how they feed of each other. How exactly? I was just thinking about the garden pavilion. where somehow there is an image of the previous pavilion, and when you take a picture of the pavilion, it looks exactly like a photo collage of done by the architects you were talking about. No, somehow, what is the nature of these?
Should we show it also because it's behind?
Yeah. Okay. That was very.
Yeah, I mean, especially in this one, it was interesting because from the beginning on, we were wanting to make this relation between the collages of Gerson and David and the work which I was making, and we just took elements of our archives and we tried to connect them. And actually, these two, we decided that we had this one image which I made in China that could be somehow linked to the elements that Gerson and David added to our pavilion. And then I decided to photograph it because I thought it was important that it again became abstract. And that actually when you would be in the space, you could look at this image as a new image again. And that it would not be a document which was there. And even a lot of people didn't recognize it. They were standing in front of this view, and it was impossible for them to see. But what was the question exactly?
No, how is exactly these? Well, I think you start to answer it. How one thing feeds off the other. You know? How they change roles and how.
Yeah, but this has probably to do with the relation of how, with the idea of how I think that you look at images and how you can construct them. That there are certain rules in order to do them, and that you can only recognize something when you saw it already before. And which also means almost that you can almost only like something if you saw it in some way before, or if you can see something back in it which you're familiar with. So that is for me the main reason to use, well, let's say to use works or elements that already exist. And I think you have to somehow update these. It's a kind of updating somehow. Getting them in our time. Yeah, in this case, it's a bit difficult to call it like this, but in the other works, which are coming from these older images, and from the works of Bals, from Bals to Herzog, maybe even to Walter Niedermeyer, you could make this kind of a link. I think it always has been like this, but more in a kind of on it's not being talked about so much.
But so you describe beautifully this idea that your pictures actually are uses of reality. Oops, sorry. You describe that your pictures are kind of uses of reality to actually produce fictional situations or realities, let's say. And I think it's that there's a nice kind of change when you move from the way your presentation work or your books work. You have this series of pictures that are all taking images of, or like pieces of other realities to build your own fictional things, but they are always your frames. You're reframing things, you're changing maybe contracts, you're like carefully always framing in a wider space, showing in pairs, but it's always your work. And there was something kind of strangely, let's say, different when you decide, and obviously it's a work between two people, but when you decide or three people in this case actually, when you decide to join forces with an architectural office, place the images of the architecture, the montages, and your images in rooms similarly as they are laid out in the catalogs. I mean, no levels, same kind of wide space around, no way of differentiated. And I was wondering what kind of fictional, if there is a difference in the kind of fictional construct that you're producing there.
There is a difference, and the difference is an interesting one, I think. That is because their work is collage, my work is photograph, so basically mine comes from a reality and then theirs wants to be somehow a reality or wants to become. And the interesting thing is that at the moment when they were standing next to each other, because it was always only one opposite of the other, that at the moment when they were standing alone in the room, then people didn't know anymore. They started to doubt both.
Yeah.
Like they started to doubt if the photo was real and if the collage was a collage. And it was very obvious that the collage was a collage. But somehow, I think in a lot of cases it was. Not in all cases, but
we have the same question with the catalog today. So yeah, there's still that tension is still there, and nobody was sure exactly which ones were pictures, and the fact that there was destabilizing moments where you will like take pictures of projects and be incorporated both as your work and their work.
Yeah. No, but so I think it is very interesting if you can get to that point that the idea of document disappears, that people really started to look at these images as something that maybe could not be, that maybe would not relate to the reality in a direct way. And that I think was the most, to me, that was the most interesting part.
Mm-hmm. So will you say that actually, because the two short texts that are in the catalog, one describe the exhibition as a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The other one describes the exhibition as a series of, let's say, pieces of architecture that are composed of two things that is hard to identify actually, but that actually you cannot even separate your pictures from the photo montages, and this is the moment when they are together to produce a completely different thing.
Yeah, but I think it has more to do with the fact that they come from a kind of similar world. So they come from a similar way of looking at the world, and that has obviously to do with the fact that we know each other since they made their first building and since I made my first book. So there's always, and Kirsten and David always see my sketch images. I see their work, their test models, their in between things. So there is a relation which is influencing each other a lot in terms of making the image, making the kind of feel of the image, how it communicates a certain reality. I think that is most important.
Mm-hmm. So will you describe the thing as a common project, or it's just a random intersection of taste?
No, it's not taste, because we are both making these things. So
yeah.
I think that is also something important. It's all made and thought of, and it's constructed very carefully. So I'm not sure if you could call that taste.
No. That was a provocation just to hear that, because that implies that it's a common project.
Yes.
It is not just a kind of.
Yeah, it's a common project which was never meant to be a common project. But when we saw it together, when we put these images next to each other, we said, it's much more relating than we ever imagined.
Yeah, so basically it's a contamination of sorts. No, one is framing, basically, but what is framing is likely to be architecture. So it's architecture playing photography, and then photography is constructing itself upon architecture that is playing photography. Is in the sense that is a contamination. One realm using somehow, I'm not saying the instruments, but at least the discourse of the other to discover things. I was very curious how suddenly these two things get very unstable and very fluid exchange between them. There's just the other thing I was very, very curious to relate this is, of course, the vernacular. Because somehow these images or these architectures relate with each other, because they both have, authors and precise agendas. They are very qualified. But the rest of your work, these objects are made out of vernacular buildings.
Yeah, they are, but they relate in another way to the architecture. And that is when they don't relate so directly as in the exhibition. They relate to the ideas that are present and to.
I was just.
Kirsten wants to ask something there.
only there because of the framing of the room, let's say, and or the page in the book. In other words, I mean, I like very much his Reservoir book, which he just presented in silence, because there you see, and I guess he did not talk about that, but in the book itself, there's this rhythm with the gray pages. And so through these gray pages rhythm, there's always a group of pictures, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3 again. I don't know exactly how it works. And you have the tendency to relate the pictures in the same way, very much like he did the presentation today. You see Concrete Rundown, you see Robert Smithson, and they have a relationship. But that's only because he tells us so. He shows the two pictures at the same time. You know, you would never connect Robert Smithson with Concrete Rundown if you'd know. And I think it's the same way here in the pavilion. And I tend to think that it's an accidental collision of course, people who have a parallel trajectory. But his work is entirely separated from ours. Well, I hope so at least. And, no, but I find it important because I think we started to work together with Bas in the knowledge that he's not a photographer of architecture. It doesn't interest him.
I think also that you work together to get things further, you know, to kind of push things 5 steps ahead while you only can do it 1 step at a time, you know. When you do this kind of thing together, it goes pretty fast all of a sudden.
Yeah, but again there, you see, you put this, I mean, like Bas was explaining, it was very interesting. We were building up the pavilion together in Venice, and Bas had that picture selected. Well, we kind of selected it together, you know, the left one, because it felt that was the right picture in relationship to what then was a model of a pavilion, because it wasn't yet a pavilion, we were building it up. And then when it was just finished, he took the picture. And many people, as he said, thought it was a collage of the pavilion and nothing else. So almost there, the opposite thing happens, you know. He has a found image, the image of China, and it's as if only with the image in the back of the mind, he could take that picture which nobody saw. You know, that picture is as much vernacular. I mean, our pavilion there becomes vernacular, and I like that. You know, all of a sudden, it's the same kind of thing as this weird roof he finds in China. I mean, there's no quality difference. There's no, you know, there's not a picture of architecture. It's a piece of architecture constructed by Bas Princen, the right picture, as much as the left. And that thing is very different. It's not a documentation of a building.
Yes. Which amounts to say they are really not related, or, you know, which was where you started, which that makes it even more strange, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think that always in many things that I photograph, I try to find back the idea that people try to put in somehow. I try to pull it out. Maybe it is a completely different one that I pull out, but you somehow have the feeling that there was quite a lot of attention when this was built. Maybe a bit a strange one, but and I think that should always be there. That the elements that are being photographed are very precise and very you know, thought of. You know? It's hard to say it in an architecture school because of course everyone would say you would never build it like this, but still it doesn't seem to be so random and so unimaginative.
One thing I was very curious is technically, what kind of camera do you use to make these images?
It's just a technical camera, but actually,
which means that they are inverted, upside down.
Yeah, they're
left
upside
way.
down. Yeah, when you see it upside down, so you see the composition better.
Which is a classic construction technique of
Yes.
images. I'm just saying this because I think the students were reading Walker Evans' interview, you know, and trying to relate these both. Walker Evans saying, well, I prefer vernacular architecture. I prefer found architecture to deal and to dialogue, you know, and there is no composition. That's kind of, you know, architecture teacher kind of parlance. That doesn't make any difference because the technique already produces that abstraction that allows to see the image without particular identifications.
Yeah, because I mean the image exists at the moment when I look through the camera. You know, then it's not that when I'm not looking through the camera and look at the same thing, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist, basically. I make it when I'm looking through this upside down image. But then again, it depends. It doesn't always say that when it works when I look through the viewfinder or through the matte glass. When it's printed or when it's again the other way around, it doesn't always work. So there is a lot of.
Hi, I wanted to go a bit more through another direction, and I think you discuss a lot your sort of aesthetic and compositional sort of references throughout your presentation. But most of your photographs also have there's a lot of ideas of labor and this sort of hints of a sort of geopolitically complex contemporary world. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about your work through that other line, which I think is very consistent throughout your body of work.
Yeah, it's a very simple. Maybe it's a very simple answer, but I think that when you think of these images as images that are made, I also like that what is in there is being made at the moment. So all the pictures, if there are people in there, they're only workers. There are people who are working and constructing, making the landscape, making the image, making the world, more or less. And I find that I find that maybe more optimistic than if I would photograph people who are basically just walking or doing something else. And that is a kind of this was from the beginning. It was there.
Yeah,
but is that enough answer? Because I also don't want to go into the kind of political part,
that's also what I find more interesting about your work.
No, I think in the book there was a question about how do you that the people are always small and how do you relate to that? And then I think I answered something like, when I'm in the landscape, I'm also just a small dot. I'm very small element in a kind of a very weird element, but very small element in this kind of landscape where everything is being made and constructed. And when I'm photographing, I feel like I'm part of making and constructing this same world.
Continue with the construction, because I think the construction is key there to be able to relate. We've been looking carefully to this catalog, and we've been reading this thing, and there is this kind of, let's say, something strange about having a pavilion that is organized between architects and photographers with the material put one in front of the other, that it's hard to tell which one is which, and actually gets the prize of the young architecture, promising architecture and what is the, let's say, what is the state, or what is the stake, or what is the proposal of architecture to get this prize. And a little bit going back to the previous question and the question of the display of geopolitical conditions, and especially in the exhibition Storefront, 5 cities was called, if I recall correctly, 5 cities. Yeah.
No, but there was also a deliberate reason why half of the book is China and half is America.
Yeah. No, but let me finish the 5 cities thing. So one could tell, as you describe your images, that if they are constructed, they are kind of sort of projects of. And then if you do an exhibition that is called 5 cities, it's basically 5 projects for cities that are constructed in a way of in the tradition of 5 cities by Super Studio. It's obviously a reference. So when I was asking for what is the common project in there, what is the proposal, what is the thing that you're constructing by putting together all these things, of there is something that you're proposing as being trained as an architect, is that will be kind of the most clear question. It's like, are you proposing a type of city? There is a type of urban environment that you're trying to, even in a fictional terms, to propose with those images?
It would be too easy to say yes on this question.
But simply by naming cities and fictional cities. I'm not saying that it's actually
no, but
city itself.
But this had another. sometimes things have also a practical reason. Huh?
Okay.
Like all these landscapes which I photograph have most of them have an economical reason.
Yeah.
That's very clear. But for the 5 cities, it was I had to go to 5 cities which I had never been, and I had 10 days per city. How to prevent being a kind of a tourist? This is impossible. So from the first day on, I decided that I cannot represent each of these cities. This would be impossible. So the thing that could be interesting is to present these 5 cities as one kind of fictional city. And in order to do that, I go to a city, I talk with a city planner, with an architect, or someone within the field and who knows the city. And we talk about where the city is reaching its limits, all these kind of banal elements, and then we choose 3 or 4 sites, of which I choose one. There I work one week, and that's how they become more specific than you would imagine in the first go. And they're all on the perimeter, because I think on the perimeter is the place where the new type of city is being constructed, and where the similarities might be the closest.
So yes. So you're basically identifying in 5 different cities common conditions of urbanity.
Yeah.
No, like that's the feeling that you get when you flip through the catalog. This is a common city built of big objects in the landscape.
Yeah, but not only that, but also the fact that all these elements in that book are pieces of the city that are not part of the fabric. They want to be on themselves. They all want to be isolated, and that was an important part for that book.
And this argument of the book, that kind of figure.
It's not. Yeah.
Anyway, there's any questions out there after this kind of short introduction? Yeah, there we go.
Actually, I find it very interesting that last year when Ivan was presenting here, his first image was also an image that he took in China, and I also found your first image was in China, and I heard from you that half of your photos in that book was from China. So my question is, I kind of have a feeling that the many of these radical proposals, those collages are actually being constructed in those developing worlds. And my question is, for you as a photographer, do you find any kind of new urbanism of urban form that is really interesting to you in those developing worlds?
You mean the reality? You mean not what I photograph, but what I see when I'm photographing?
I think both in your photographs and what you see.
It's something I don't think too much about when I'm photographing. So I look at the place, whether it has a potential to make something else out of it, to take a piece and to transform that. It's very hard to explain, but if you cut off left and right and top and bottom, then all of a sudden you can start to imagine a place as a kind of endless elements that you photographed in the middle, no? So a lot of times these pictures have very little to do with maybe it only has to do something with the detail, but not with the kind of overall structure of the city. And I think that what I found interesting, to go back to this kind of super studio elements, I think it is part of our collective memory, these projects. So somehow, unconsciously, they are partly being built, because the aesthetic exists, and somehow you can use it.
Cesar there.
sure if I'm. It's
use
really
the
a question
microphone.
again. There's something. I mean, when one thinks of photography in an abstract term, there's something already somewhat tautological about you're repeating endlessly a moment that happens only once, an event, and something similar to me. There's something also tautological in this idea of the image that begets another image that begets another one, and this sort of constant. I'm very intrigued by this idea. At the same time, there's something. I'm wondering if you find that sort of thing somewhat paralyzing at some point, in the sense that you cannot, let's say, you see reality basically not directly, but actually through this sort of collective memory, through this bank of images that we have accumulated. Is there a moment where you think that we'll fill that bank of images and you want to sort of step out of that? So not, if you want, add an image that is a sort of composite. So I'm wondering, how do you get, I'm wondering if one could sort of get trapped into that sort of endless, repetition in a positive way, or if you feel that at some point, let's say, I don't want to see this canyon through the lens of Smithson. I wanna
Yeah, but I mean, if you mean particular for me or for you as a viewer?
Well, I would say for you as an artist.
Yeah. But I think for me it's important. At the moment when I see it, it disappears immediately because I can transform it, and that to me it's not a burden at all. It helps me to make a choice whether to photograph something or not. Because there's endless amounts of things, that you can that you can photograph and document and put together. There needs to be a trigger, and it's not always. I mean, as I say, it's not always a reference. It can also be another image which I made before, and then you are already much closer to the idea of a series, but more kind of traditional way of a series. No? And sometimes I make one which is completely unrelated to anything, and then I try to find the gaps in between. Yeah, but by updating these ideas, you also somehow destroy that memory partly. You kind of replace it, which I find again an interesting idea.
That's interesting. Just to kind of push on that again, and that reminds me of your comment about the Louis Baltz photographs, that you couldn't tell whether they were being constructed or destructed, right? So there's something perhaps similar in that. But I wanted to push you a little more on why these particular legacies should be the ones that we would then look at China today through. Or how do you choose? I mean, like, why is the legacy of Smithson or the legacy, let's say, of land art the one that we would want to choose to impose upon a view upon, say, China today or the Middle East today? Likewise, why that moment of super studio, that moment of where a utopian project sort of fizzles or becomes negative? Why those? How do you select those particular elements of the reservoir? And is there, because that was your argument.
There's also many. I mean, I use the ones which are most famous, but there's endless amounts which are completely anonymous. I have a lot of the images which I use as references are just rarely anyone saw it.
But is there, I guess the question is there, your argument about using images to create new images, I think is a strong one and an important one, but is there another agenda within the selection of these? Because it's also imposing a certain legacy upon the present, right?
So I'm trying to figure out to what extent there's a secondary argument within the very selection of these particular memories from the reservoir.
And not very consciously.
It's a fantastic
Maybe I
photo
don't want to answer it.
to photograph the realization, of
Yeah.
all the negative sort of utopia of Super Studio, just in China. There's or somewhere else.
Yeah, but it
it's,
was in China and in the States, so it's not only in China.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going also, to see if there's sort of like a social agenda aside from the sort of historical references that you point out that are sometimes obvious, sometimes less, but I think your work is much more interesting because of its sort of like social message that through labor camps or any other of the other things you document. I mean, the first image you opened with, I think, is a very representative of what I think we're both trying to say. And I kind of, I mean, I don't know, I read your work more through those lines and through the sort of historical reference lens, right? I don't know, it's more like comments rather than.
Yes, Chantal.
No, but I heard you also looked at, you also talked about Giri, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
And Giri has this extremely beautiful book which is called Atalante, in which, did you talk about it or not?
We
Look
we
at.
talked specifically at the articulation between all the work of Aldo Rossi
yeah.
and the work of Giri,
Yeah.
of course.
No, but in Atalante he does something, he photographs
maps.
maps.
Yeah.
And he says in the text that he writes next to it, he says, if I photograph the map of a certain landscape, it's exactly the same as photographing, it has exactly the same result as photographing the actual landscape. And this I found very, very interesting idea, because he doesn't have also this idea of the document as something which relate to reality. But sorry.
And probably that's why there is such a. Giri is not an architecture photographer.
No.
Yeah?
No.
And it's pretty amazing. I recall when Giri's photos of Rossi were put together with Rossi's own Polaroids. That was a very, very strange, just cross pollination between the two things. Because of course, it's not just a symbiotic relation. The idea we have of Aldo Rossi's work is through the lenses of Luigi Giri. And there is no diminishing of any of those works by that entanglement. So it's a very, I thought it was a very curious parallel, that's why I throw it. And of course, there was a whole sort of, the Atlante, the whole notion of the survey, that comes from Italian photography from the 60s and 70s, that probably is also informing
But
all these other surveys.
Let's get
Sorry.
into the relationship between you and Archie, because we've been talking about your own your pictures when you go to the city and you choose where you take pictures. But if I'm correct, but basically when you take pictures of works of architecture, you mainly work with or for, or I don't know what the relationships with office, and I assume there have to be a different procedure. Or it works the same. You have a set of, you can go around and outskirts of the city and look for, reference. But what is the relationship when you have to take pictures of the pavilion after the party's over, for example?
No, it's the same rough material as that you find in a city. So you can treat it in a similar way.
So you're looking for also.
I'm looking for something to transform it again. Obviously.
So no. That's interesting, because my question will be like the pictures of office buildings in the exhibition.
No, but I think that sometimes I show things to Kirsten and David, and then they're saying, "Oh, is it our building? We didn't really see it like this yet." And maybe that's.
So in that sense, I think it's even true that what you know of our work has completely been manipulated by his photography. I mean, that's true, which is okay. I mean, No, I mean that's a kind of decision which probably we all took together unconsciously. That was never really like let's do it this way, but it developed that way. But of many things, there's only the picture of Bas. So, and in that sense, it was maybe interesting if I think about that now today in this conversation, to combine his pictures, I mean, of his other work, his main work, the key work. I mean, what he actually does. With collages of ours, and to see that there were parallels. So it was somehow reassuring that maybe when he takes pictures of our buildings, I mean, he doesn't fuck them up. But apart from that, I mean, he just does what he does. I mean, we have no influence.
No, I'm not.
No, but that's important to realize that. I mean, because I know a lot of, let's say, architecture photography happens in a very different way. I mean, let's say, I'm not a specialist, but there's certainly a mode in which a photographer takes 100 pictures and then you select 3 and say, these 3 I like, so let's publish these. Or another one where you hang around with the photographer and say, come at this corner, you have to take this picture. And I mean, we both ways we don't do. So it's just Bas does things and he chooses to.
Yeah, but I think also you have to also understand that, I see a lot of the work before it's actually being finished.
Yeah, true.
I see all the states from a failed model to the final thing, and somehow I always try to put some of those ideas which maybe got lost in the meantime. I try to put them back or to find places where you could recognize them again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but you see, I only want to stress that we're extremely lucky. I mean, he's just taking pictures on his own right, and it somehow matches by accident. And I find that's why I always try to turn back the conversation to his Reservoir book, because I think it's far more important and far more interesting than the pictures he does or he did together with us.
Yeah, but in a way, the way, what is the role of the photographer in the practice of architecture? It seems that is kind of the question key here, and like in the session, and it's really curious. I mean, you describe that you're following.
But I can also tell you it in a quite other way, because I'm a very bad photographer for them, because my connection to magazines, for instance, is not very good. So I'm very bad in that sense. Because if you take someone like Ivan Baan, then the magazines call him, not the offices, so an office wants to work with him also because he is the kind of person that is the in-between person that gets things out, and in that element I'm not really interested, and that's somehow a bit problematic. But I don't think I'm an architecture photographer, so I don't have to mind so much.
You are also the author of some of the most successful images of that office. In a way, because I mean, but seriously, what I'm trying to come here is like, okay,
but you wanted to ask something more in general about architecture.
No, like what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to say is, you explained the process of construction of images as a fiction, as a construction of a fiction, that you take responsibility for the fiction, not necessarily related what is out there, but actually you try through series of references and kind of a culture of the imaginary of whether it is 70s practices or other more kind of anonymous images, are able to construct things. Mm-hmm. There are pictures that not necessarily relate in a direct way with geopolitical conditions, even they are sometimes able to translate or even be traces of that and allow people to read it. And that's it's a really feasible strategy when you present it as your own practice. Mm-hmm. But when it has to intersect with the practice of someone else, it requires a negotiation or some sort of. And that's what I'm interested in. That's why, like when you say, like, I don't know anything what he say, but by chance, it's perfect for us because we really like it. I'm curious about what it means to construct the images of someone else.
No, I think, but this is not so different as that there's different states of a project. The drawing looks absolutely different than the model of a building, and the model looks different than the finished building. So the photograph can look completely different than any of those three. And I'm interested in the autonomy of each of them.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask maybe one last question before we hear a bit more from some students, I hope. And I hope that I'll actually also take a slightly different tack. I'm struck by the language that is used to describe your photographs, and especially by the sort of points that seem to suggest a kind of procedure, like selecting and you're the individual in the situation, and so you're somehow already like inscribed into this bigger sort of geopolitical picture. And I mean, I think it's all very interesting and compelling. And at the same time, and maybe precisely for that reason, I'm curious about the use of unconscious, and especially in the context of the sort of making that you acknowledge that you're taking pictures of, and maybe other kinds of making also that we see in your pictures. The curtain wall, for example, a kind of building making conceptual apparatus as well as a physical assembly. And so it all seems to like sort of flow into a sort of passive, or a picture of sort of passivity, or you're like just one of many variables in this sort of big equation. And given all that, I'm curious to know maybe like how you would respond to a question I might ask of any artist, not necessarily knowing what he did, which is, what is your relationship to prettiness? I mean, do you?
No, I think it has to, the image has to work. So it has to visually work, it has to somehow appeal. Now, this is important because it's a visual, this is the way how you communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, it's above all the others.
And then my further question would be,
But
do you see,
prettiness
like,
is a bit difficult
yeah.
in relation to photography, because is it about the way how the image is built up, or is it about what is being photographed? You know?
Okay, but then do you see the prettiness, or the, say, entanglement of the aesthetic and the sort of non-aesthetic as somehow feeding back into the meaning of your pictures precisely in this larger framework of social relationships and geopolitics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Can you repeat the last part?
Like, if in a sense it's like a kind of Russian doll with the big systems, and in this particular part of the systems, yourself taking the picture and arriving at this pretty object, is there some way in which that has some significance that we might find in this, like what does it mean to make that moment pretty, precisely in this bigger system? That's a very difficult question. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say because that is that's quite a subjective thing. What's happening? It happens behind the camera, actually. You know, it happens. It happens when I look through. When I see the image, let's say, for the first time, when it's upside down in front of me. Then I know all of the implications of what I'm doing, more or less. How should I answer this? It's the most important moment for me, because there I see there I feel most as a maker, and maybe that's maybe the only answer I can give you.
I've
Can I? My question is partly related, so I just wanted to go ahead and jump in. I think what she asked kind of got me thinking as well. Like, after you've taken the pictures and you have this selection, what exactly is the definition of what is pretty? Like, if you could kind of relate what characteristics are you looking for that define what makes the cut? Because obviously there's some level of editing afterwards.
Well, there's a huge level
So
of editing. Yeah.
retrospectively looking back at what has made it into the book and what you choose to represent yourself, what do you think is the common thread? Minus the theory in the background, just strictly photography. What do you think would be the common thread?
No, the common thread is a very simple. I mean, the most basic thread, which is lying on top of all the images, is this kind of let's say uncertainty of what you're looking at. So the uncertainty of if you're looking at something which is constructed or not, if it's natural or not, if it's to which time it belongs. All these elements are the things that bind the images together. But in order to make the cut, this is an endless process of because one picture can work next to the other one, but it cannot work next to the other one. So it's an endless puzzle when the rhythm works, because the work is so different from each. I mean, what is shown is very different from each other. So you cannot just put every image next to the other one, and that's quite unconscious. You just have to see it. It's a kind of so the dummy which is made is endlessly being changed, and it can even differ from the fact if a photograph works better on a left page or on a right page, because you read it in a different way. Your eye moves in a different way.
You were speaking of your process as that of manipulating and transforming reality to create a new fiction, and then we started talking about conventional quote-unquote architectural photographers as doing something similar but perhaps for different reasons. Why do you think, and if you do think, that one kind of architectural photography should be valued more than the other? And do you think that it would be possible to document architecture in an objective way?
No, I don't think you can do it in an objective way. And I don't think it's interesting, because I think you should always have the need to go and see these buildings, because the reality is always so different. I know all the tricks, and I'm still completely surprised sometimes what is the difference between a picture and a real building. It's sometimes pretty shocking, but I like that. I like that, and I don't like it when everything looks the same. So I don't like if all the buildings are photographed in a similar way.
Is your work about framing a interesting moment in an interesting existing moment, or is it about creating a new reality altogether?
I mean, it always has to do with because since it's always half a construction, it obviously has to do something with the time when it's made. But it's not my intention to focus too much on that. But there was a couple of weeks ago, there was another question. Someone asked me in a panel whether my photographs were going to be seen as images of the future or images of the past. And then I thought, yeah, this is a very strange question, because obviously I think now, because I'm making them, they look, maybe they represent something from the future, but very soon, in a couple of years' time, they will definitely represent something of the past, because this is inevitable. You can't escape that.
Could you explain us why you are interested in finding relations between photos? I mean, I can understand that one photo can give information for another one when they are posed one to each other. But do you think that if you would give a photo by itself, it wouldn't speak so much?
No, it would also. I lost it a bit. Can you say it once again? No, because it's a good question. I mean, there's a.
Yes, I have understood that you are working very much in this way, that you are interested to find relationships in between photos. So you are using them in pairs, let's say, or in groups. And I am wondering why you need to do that, because you find that each one of these photos cannot give this moment.
No,
by
I think that there's let's say maybe there's 50 kind of standard compositions. Let's say let's put it like that. Huh? You have 50 ways of building up an image, which all work somehow, and you want to use them, and you want to also, in the process of using them, you want to alter them a bit, because you want to find the kind of limits of that. Because I think it's always about these kind of things, that there's rules of how you look at things. There is, the golden section, all these kind of things. They're all in there, of course. You have to use them because that's how we look at images. So I also use the images which I mentioned to learn from, in order to be able to make a composition and then alter it slightly. So you can push it a little bit. I can't say it in another way, but it's a kind of it's a kind of challenge of inventing a new composition, but you can only do it by altering one which exists already.
I'd like to ask if you consciously choose the precedents that you're going to use and then try to look to ways to upgrade them, or you go post factum and realize that this is what relates to my new image, and
no. It's they exist before.
Yeah, sure, but
yeah.
Do you decide before you go to shoot the places?
No. There's like maybe there's like 1,000 images, and when I see something, then I can relate it to the image that I already know.
So go back and connect it to the previous one.
Yeah. So, just one. Yeah, I'm more interested in the strategies of your project, specifically because I mean of the parallels between the different disciplines and precisely with architecture. So I would like to ask you, once this legacy of the image is acknowledged, you have two different ways, two different paths. A, either you build upon the familiarity of that image, acquiring some sort of hyper-consciousness of that reality, or B, you build towards a defamiliarization of that legacy, of that past. And I think that for me, your work has both qualities, and some of your images are building upon that familiarization. Some of them are playing with that defamiliarization of previous experiences. I would like to ask you if you feel more comfortable with one of them.
No, they're both elements to use.
Can you have one last?
But I think that it's always important that there's also something photographically interesting in what there is being. I'm now working, for instance, in a gold mine in South America. It's a gold mine. I think I had some images before, but I will. And it has a lot of. There is a lot of things that I'm interested in, and there's on many levels. So I'm interested in the fact that it's it's a very contemporary landscape somehow. It still looks a bit old-fashioned, but it's very contemporary because this is the way how most of the gold is being won at the moment. A kind of illegal mining in the Amazon jungle. But I went there because I found out that it has all the colors of sand. It has incredible amount of range of color of sand, and I thought that this was photographically very interesting to go there. That's a reason to go there. It's not because I like the subject so much, but there has to be something extra on top of it. And then I'm already for a while trying to make a kind of upside down compositions. So meaning that that the weight of the image is in the top. That and there is a couple of them. And this is something. And this one is the same. The weight is in the top. And somehow it's counterintuitive. You don't want, you feel a little bit uncomfortable looking at something which has a horizon which is on the wrong spot. This one is the same. It's so there's all these kind of elements with which you can start to play, and I mean it's kind of counter the rule, but you have to know the rules very well in order to be able to reduce them against itself. So that's what when I'm there, I'm not only looking at this landscape, I'm thinking of all these elements. So how can I make this upside down composition? How can I take advantage of this kind of color? How can I still update an image which is already made 100 years ago to put it in our time? That's it.
Yeah. One point I found one observation I found very interesting in the conversation so far is this idea of the presence of the past and the future in your work. And the past is very clearly present, and as you mentioned, the future is also present, but the future will shortly be the past. I don't know if you were saying that in relation to commercial cycles or whatever. But it also seems to me that there's a much more radical sense of time operating in some of your work, because what we're seeing is a level of human intervention into the natural environment that's almost unprecedented. For example, one really striking image was the image which I think was taken in China, where you have this huge edifice, these cliffs, and then what looks like some kind of some building kind of springing upward out of these cliffs. And you know, with that degree of intervention into the physical environment, it sometimes becomes very difficult to tell which process is overtaking which process. You know, I mean, are we seeing kind of human construction on top of a natural environment, or are we seeing something that kind of grew organically out of the natural environment? You know, the level of intervention is so extreme that those two points become very blurred. And some of these things, for example, in the work of Smithson and that piece, the asphalt pour, or whatever it's called, some of those things in Smithson's time could only be imagined and staged, whereas now they're very, you know, those kinds of interventions are very commonplace. So in that sense, it seems that I'm not sure how conscious it is on your part, but there's a very strongly historical bent to your work, and more specifically, a commentary on environmental history. And I'm wondering how conscious that is in your process.
It's pretty conscious, and it probably has to do with the fact that I'm Dutch. We are already constructing for ages, and everything which we call nature we already made way before, and for me it's a kind of natural given. So I like also to understand. I like to play with this idea, because actually what you're saying, the image that you're describing is actually the other way around. You know, I mean, you want it to be a kind of a natural cliff with the new buildings on top, but actually it were buildings on which they modeled cliff. And I think exactly already the fact that, that for you, you know, that there is the interesting part, that even it almost doesn't matter anymore what was first, what was last.
My question actually builds on that one quite a bit, so that I'm not totally sure how to take it in the other direction. I do feel like I need to premise the question by saying that I'm a total photography Luddite and I don't really know how to read photos. But I get the uncanny feeling when I'm looking at a lot of your photos that while the architecture is in the foreground, it becomes quickly for me in the background, actually, to the point where I'm wondering, what does it mean for you to be a photographer of architecture? What does it mean to photograph architecture? And you mentioned earlier on in your presentation that by choosing the aspects that you find appealing or wish to highlight, you can actually frame something to the point where it changes that experience. Whereas I find that all of the buildings, or I guess what we can more formally think of architecture in terms of built form, is built in a way, or framed rather, by the things that are around it, if that makes any sense. Just this kind of inversion of the, yeah.
It's clear that it's, for me, I always wanted to be, that the two elements are more or less equal. So you can almost not say which one is more important, if it's the building or the surrounding, or the surrounding or the building. And that was there from the beginning, from the first pictures that I took, where the people are standing in the landscape. Also there, it was almost impossible to imagine. They were equal somehow, equally important, the landscape and the people which are in it. And the people have been replaced now by buildings or structures.
And then the second question I had to do with the article that you suggested that we all read, with the interview with Walker. And it has to do with the question of transcendence. And the question kind of came to me when you showed the photo of the construction of the space for Le Poème Électronique. And I was kind of thinking about how music functions in terms of trying to create transcendence in its interaction with architecture, versus when you're talking about creating some experience that transcends with architecture. The idea with sound in the space was the idea that the sound could interact in a way that actually goes beyond the form of the space. And so in that sense, that's what I guess, I forget who the composer was, it's really embarrassing, Stockhausen or Xenakis, meant by transcending space. But I was wondering how your photograph of that space was intending to transcend, if that was something you were hoping to do.
No.
Last question.
It was nice to have you here. Thank you for coming. Just a simple question about how you work, because I'm wondering how a photographer works. As I understood it, you are more like a collector of, artist collector of information and references, and instantly taking photos. But when it comes to have a piece of work, are you studying on the side and take one picture that you directed for a couple of hours, or you take a lot of pictures, one after the other, and you choose one? And the second part of my question is, how much is the new technologies has to do with, you said that sometimes you flip your images because they stand better and it's a better result. Is Photoshop maybe in your, not only about colors, but about cropping your image, showing exactly a part of your image and make, or...
No, but let's go back to your first question, because I mean, it is indeed important to explain how, because it's not only reference, it's a lot of, I need to have a lot of knowledge of the cities and the places where I go. This is a, for instance, when I lived in China for 4 months in a place called Xiamen, which is an island in front of the, well, let's say opposite of Taiwan in China. And there I would bike every day with my camera, I would bike basically for 4 months the same route, and just divert a slight bit every day. And by starting to understand this route and starting to understand what was going on, I also knew on what places I had to be on what moments. So it's a careful studying of a you cannot just find these things. You have to develop the instinct, let's say. And it takes quite a bit of time and quite a bit of effort to be able to read this kind of structures.
Yeah. You finished the sorry. You finished the question. No?
Yes.
Or okay. I wanted to ask, like, starting from two different points. I'm going to appropriate something that you said and something that Kirsten said. In the first, I'm interested in this translation from fiction to reality in the collages of the work of Office. As a vector, and as the vector of photography as the inverse vector of reality into fiction, and how these two vectors collide, understanding that they are both different, but suddenly they collide, fortunately, or that is what Kirsten said, right? So there is another collision that is actual and it's real, and it's produced in the pavilion. So there is in the pavilion we see a fictionalized reality inside a realized fiction. So suddenly we have like a situation that is generating an amplification of meaning and of new shocks for everybody who uses the pavilion by using both the photography and the architecture in which it's inscribed. So how would you define or how would you, this is a question for both of you, for the architect and for the photographer. How has this collision modified your way of working, and what new meanings has it produced for both of you that you didn't expect, or maybe you did expect?
No, the most what it produced is that somehow I understood that the image is much more unstable than it actually is supposed to be if you put it next to something similar, but which is quite different. And that I found very powerful, and it's something that I will use more, because I think it's something that can actually create almost a certain space, and that is interesting.
Mm-hmm. No, maybe, I guess, I'm not even sure, but I suspect it had to do a lot with that collaboration. I think for us, the pavilion was very much, it gave us very much the insight that you even need less architecture to do architecture. And I think that had, in the end, a lot to do with the pictures of Bas. Of course, I mean, you know, we knew the pictures, as Bas had endlessly explained. I mean, I probably saw them 100 times before. We made the selection, and we made the pre-selection, and all that kind of stuff. But somehow confronting this, for example, if you see these two images, this one collage, which seems to be a lot of architecture, and the other picture, which seems to be almost no architecture. And then, of course...
except if you start to imagine that one could be the scale of that.
Well, exactly. So, with this ambiguity there, for me, especially when he took the picture in August, beginning of August, of the pavilion itself, which is the picture he showed a couple of times before, somehow I think, realized that you hardly need to do any intervention to turn building into architecture. It's only a matter of a very limited set of conscious decisions. So doing all the time less. And in some way, that's also how I read Bas's images. I mean, you know, it's already all there. It's just a matter of framing. I mean, that matter is extremely complicated. I mean, I couple of times was with him on a trip, and I simply don't see what he takes a picture of. So it's really, it's very particular. We have a lot of these anecdotes when we were even with a couple of people, and then people pointing out to, you know, take a picture of that, it's very nice, and he turns the camera and takes the picture of the other side, which becomes then a very important picture. So we don't see it. But then again, I think as a reflection to our architecture, you know, when we were dealing with this pavilion, or when we got that pavilion from Sanaa, from Sejima, and we both, I mean, Bas and us, we had to work with it. We were first completely frustrated because we had no money, and we had to turn it into a piece of architecture. And then somehow, it's that fiction of Bas's picture, it has been said before, which all of a sudden gives it the status it wanted to acquire. I think even more, and if you, I don't know, if you flip to the images, I think the picture more than the actual building. That's interesting. So that's the actual building. I mean, it's the same thing. And then I think the next one, no, one before. No. Yeah, so that's the actual building, and yeah, and that's the picture. So the picture is much better. Which happens. But no, but it's much better. I mean, I think the picture. No, but I believe that the picture.
Maybe that's also an answer to the question of
I believe the picture grasps what was there, but the other pictures don't do that. That's very strange. So I think the pavilion really was like that picture, and that had to.
But there's also something, and that's really some. If you are in one of the buildings that you made, or one of the objects that you made, they are always very pleasant places to be, and this is something you cannot photograph. It's impossible to photograph. I have never seen anyone to photograph a place that is pleasant to be, and then you can reproduce that. So you have to make it more abstract.
Well, but that's the thing. So that picture, exactly, that picture manages to grasp the building much better than, let's say, the other picture, which is a kind of more casual picture. This one, although you might think, yeah, you know, here you see sun and whatever, but there's nothing about it. The pavilion really was like his picture, even though that picture doesn't look like a reality, and that is interesting. And it in a way only focuses on these few things. So people were kind of, you know, they saw this thing and they said, well, how is that possible? These columns are surreally thin. But they are surreally thin, but then somehow very different. So yeah, for me, really, the moment of putting it all together was a confrontation with the almost nothing. And it's the intention rather than, you know, the energy of a lot. Yeah, almost nothing. Somehow.
Okay, so with these notes on how close you have to be to reality to produce fiction, we close and we thank Bas for enduring this thing.